So you can't, that's so, okay. Speaker, we think it's incredibly harmful that big tech companies with sufficient resources to create good quality products coerce their customer base to blindly purchase more products. We say that it was harmful not just from a consumer's perspective, but from an environmental one and from a political one. To the extent that NEG wants to claim innovation, we say that it's futile innovation and that it was innovation that makes up for the harm that they opted into in the first place. 4 points I will bring to you in my speech. Firstly, why this is economically exploitative. Secondly, why this is anti-competitive. Thirdly, why it's politically devastating. And fourthly, why it's environmentally damaging. But firstly, before I get into my speech, just a few points on setup. I think the first thing to note is that the actors that are likely to be, impacted is mainly tech companies. This is because there are extensive established practices by which they actively opt in and they actively coerce their customer base by making their products worse, right? We say that tech is a field where consumers are incredibly unclear of the qualities of these tech products, and they're really likely to just buy into whatever bullshit they tell you, right? And the second thing is that consumers are just generally unsure of how a lot of these tech products even operate in the first place, right? Like they don't have an engineer's perspective of how that particular item that they're buying is particularly good in a certain way, right? The second thing to note is that this debate assumes that these companies can produce and have sufficient, if not extensive, capital and resources to create good quality products. We are talking about actors like Apple, we're talking about actors like Amazon, we're talking about actors like Windows, etc., etc. So then on to the issue of how these fines will work. We say that firstly these fines will apply to explicit instances of these obsolescence, right? That kind of looks like altering a product that has been, after a product has been made, like the company will tamper with it to reduce its lifespan. That sort of looks like the sort of software updates that Apple has, which is deliberately imposed to degrade the battery life of your phone so that you immediately opt into buying better phones, or like newer phones, not better. The second thing is that when the production process, deviates significantly from standard practices, that sort of looks like using subpar material from what other companies would otherwise use. We say that like deliberately sort of like harming your products takes form in that way as well. And thirdly, we say that these fines would just be decided in court. So firstly, on to my first point of rebuttal, first substantive point, which is why this is economically exploitative. We think it's important from a principled perspective that people are not being lied to when they are purchasing a product. That is to say that firstly, people are not aware that these corporations are doing these like ridiculously egregious acts to make profit, right? The second thing to know is that they're buying the good at a price with foresight that this $3,000 iPhone is probably going to last me 5 years instead of the actual 2 years, right? Because they deliver a product on a promise that's going to last them for a really long time, when they're just being lied to by those companies that sort of like are able to control the ways in which like they claim their products will work, right? The harms of this is that principally you just lie to your consumers. We say that firstly, there are extensive government regulations in place for a lot of other products when consumers are uninformed, and we say that it's particularly exploitative when it comes to things like tech, when it comes to things like phones, which everybody needs, and especially when it comes to things that are incredibly expensive because phones cost thousands of dollars, right? The second thing under this is that it's just like economically coercive. This is because constantly needing to buy and replace things like means that people are just like needing to spend a lot more money than they otherwise would. For example, a brick phone in the past might, allow you to use that brick phone for like 10 years, right? Whereas an iPhone now, which is so much more expensive comparatively, will only last you 2 years. We say that it's just economic coercive, and we think that the impact of this is that it's incredibly harmful because these are consumer products for everyone, which means you particularly harm those of lower SES backgrounds. You particularly harm those, you deprive them of the ability to have properly functioning technology, because maybe $3,000 means far more to them than it would to other people. Okay, cool. The comparison then that we offer is that when products have a longer life cycle, you are prompted to change your product, not because it breaks down, but because you actually just want to change your phone. For example, I'm kind of sick of my phone, I've had it for 6 years, I might want to opt for like a cooler camera, I might want to opt for like better things, right? See how consumers suddenly have more choice and autonomy when they otherwise were coerced to spending these money? We say that NEG wants to claim, increased competition. We say the impact of this, like NEG might want to claim things like increased competition, right? We say that the impact of this is whilst you get faster replacement rates onto the NEG, there is no actual meaningful competition. Okay, the second point that I'll bring to you today is why it's anti-competitive. And I think this kind of falls under three main reasons. Firstly, when these products break down, the only way to repair them is to go back to the manufacturer. That kind of looks like me when my battery life, only lasts for 2 hours every day and I never bring a portable charger. I have to go back to Apple and get really, really mad at them, but I can't do anything because I'm effectively powerless in that specific situation and I have to pay them more money back even though their product failed me. The second thing is that because these are replaced at such a fast rate, the only difference between products the products that they push out is an aesthetic one, like new products that they push out is an aesthetic update rather than actual change in those products. That sort of looks like, what's the actual difference between an iPhone 12 and like an iPhone 17 Max? It's probably not very substantial, right? Neg would want to claim, innovation exists. Yes, you get the same version of same old shit. Like people are forced to buy into that shit. But like under our side, people can choose to change those things because companies will be like, okay, so how are we going to get people to buy our products, right? We probably need to come up with better quality. We probably need to come up with like better functions within our phone in and of itself. Like the innovation that you get under Neg's side is things that make up for the loss that you get under the status quo, whereas for us you actually get proper innovation, proper new functions. That was particularly important in this space. The third thing under this is like the way people are prompted to swap products is that their products break down, right? So the product they're looking for is a replacement of that thing, which means you get no meaningful change, and that is just anti-competitive. This is like a ridiculously anti-competitive model for businesses to function. The third point of substantive is why this is like incredibly politically devastating, right? We say the first thing to note is that most tech products made by really rare earth minerals, right? And the issue with these earth minerals is that the majority of them are sourced in like countries with really dodgy political practices, right? That kind of looks like China, that sort of looks like North Korea, that sort of looks like Russia, right? The impacts of this is that if we deplete rare earth minerals faster at the current rates in which we are doing, right? Because like our battery life, our laptop life is really bad and you always feel like you need to keep buying things, right? Firstly, the prices will go up for these tech products even more, which means you disadvantage consumers completely, right? The second thing is you give these countries with perverse political incentives power over you, right? For example, if you wanted to stop trade with China because they're doing some really immoral thing, you can't do that anymore because they have political leverage over you, because they have minerals that will be able to provide people in your society better technological phones, and you're always going to opt in for that because technology is probably super important to those people, right? And you probably do need these phones. The fourth and final point of substantive is why it's environmentally damaging. We think this is pretty straightforward. We say when people ditch their phones, when people ditch their laptops, they're forced to when they're forced to sort of throw away their printers and their chips. It's worse for the environment because you just get more waste. Notably, this waste is critical because it involves chemically bonded products, and plastics, which takes millions of years to break down. So you're not only harming the environment entirely, you're not only disempowering your consumer base, but you're just doing really stupid stuff. And because of all of that, we're really, really proud to propose.
The odd thing about that speech was that it never proved a mechanism and never proved why that mechanism was effective. Because they never proved that fines would fundamentally deter the way in which corporations would act. They never proved why that would necessarily be at all good. So I'm going to engage with that and prove why that mechanism does not work, and then prove why, even if it did work, this was still going to be a fundamentally bad idea. First, on why this mechanism doesn't work. They never proved why the cost of these fines could necessarily just be shoved onto consumers or onto the factors of production to make it worse. And that is exactly how corporations deal with any fine. They just shove up the prices, which means that consumers pay more. And if you believe all the material as to how these are super coercive and make consumers just buy all these different products, it's unclear why that's necessarily a good thing to have this economic coercion be inflicted upon consumers who now have to pay way, way extra for phones that they absolutely need. But even if it is is not inflicted on consumers, this is obviously inflicted on the factors of production that lead to the development of these phones. That is to say, more people in China that are poor, that are economically underprivileged, will just be paid less or will be fired, and you will just have to force those people to do even more work to produce the same amount of things, so that companies are able to maintain their profit margins and satisfy their shareholders and fulfill their fiduciary obligations, which is why fundamentally they've lost this debate at 1 minute 22 seconds of my speech. But let's be charitable and presume that this actually does work. I'm going to do a couple of things in this speech. First, I'm going to prove why this isn't actually a real problem that you necessarily have to fix. Second, I'll prove why this actually stifles innovation. Thirdly, I'll prove why this is worse for the developing world. And lastly, I'll deal with the environment. Firstly, and why this is not a problem that we actually have to fix. Firstly, note that the status quo is in and of itself pretty sufficient. That is to say, there's a lot of regulation that exists that ensures that you can't just have light bulbs that work for 2 hours and break, and that is likely to be the case because consumers do not want light bulbs that last for 1 hour or 2 hours and therefore just break. That is a lot of political capital that forces things like regulations, that forces things like tribunals to exist. That means that you just have to have warranties and those sorts of standards, which suggests that there is already a lot of infrastructure to take out the worst harms that they say exist. Note that this just looks like Apple giving out phones when there are defects and stuff, and obviously those things are likely to exist because they're empirically true. But secondly, we say that consumer incentives also means that these corporations aren't likely to do very good stuff. Because if you are a consumer, you want to have good products, which is why you will buy good products. You will not buy a product that will necessarily be super bad or have the worst battery life ever. They just say, well, you just lie about this stuff, and you're just going to be so terrible, and you're not going to say there's going to be misinformation as to how well these products work. That is just empirically not true. Everyone knows that planned obsolescence is a thing at the moment, and if that is the truth, that's not a reason to then incur fines, that's a reason to inform consumers, and that's something we can do under our side as well. So clearly their principal material is kind of dissuaded there. But thirdly, just note that these aren't actually real harms. I'm going to go through what these forms of obsolescence actually look like and prove why they're not real harms. The first obsolescence is you now prevent repairs because you just can't repair those sorts of things. That is not actually harmful because you just basically pay the cost of the repair anyway, and at the point where you are the person that had damaged the glass on the phone screen that you opted into because it looks shinier and glossier, that is something that you should probably incur, and it's no explanation we heard from side Affirmative as to why corporations should incur that. This probably just makes people way less likely to be bad and negligent with their stuff, which actually just lowers the price of the things they have to pay at the point where people are being a little bit more careful under our side. Secondly, they say the second sort of obsolescence here is contrived durability. So for instance, batteries not lasting very, very long. Note that at the point where you have to go back to Apple, that is fundamentally good for the people that are working in manufacturing, working in repairs, that try and solve those issues. That means that under our side, if those people get jobs, and it's not just Apple, it's also every other carpenter or every other phone engineer person that works there, all those people are just far more employed. That's very important because those people don't have very much money in the first place. They're likely to be rather poor, and even if maybe there is a small cost that consumers accrue, that is probably a fine trade-off if we are actually empowering large swathes of people that don't have very much money, that can't transition into higher skilled jobs to have to actually earn that money in the first place. That's why that's probably better. But also note that there's a point on safety here, which is to say, if it is true that actually, never mind. So that's why contrived durability doesn't actually matter, and even if it does matter, obviously the empowerment of workers probably matters more. The third thing here is perceived obsolescence, which is the perception that Claire told you about how these phones might not necessarily be all that good. If it is true that people don't perceive the distinction between, so the first response is obviously there is probably a huge difference between an iPhone 10 or an iPhone 13. Even if it's not a huge difference, it's still a difference that people are willing to pay for. But if it is true that there is not that much of a difference, we don't think that the government necessarily should arbitrate between those two things, because obviously consumers can just make that preference, and if they really do want to have better stuff and better new cameras, they can obviously just choose to opt into those things later down the line anyway. Or just buy the phone that they had before that still works because those things are still being sold but for much lower prices, so really there just isn't a harm here. So we think that consumers can make those choices. Note that also there are just better options, right? Like if you do not want to buy an Apple and if you just want a phone that functions and if you're a poor person, you can buy a Motorola and that'll probably last you a long time and that satisfies all your needs. And those things become better as well and they do not fall prey to all the stuff that they spoke about earlier. But also, just note that sometimes software is just shit and sometimes needs to be replaced sometimes, and that is something they haven't contended with. That's why the problem doesn't exist and takes away their impetus in this debate. Secondly, why this reduces innovation. And note that this is entirely contingent on all the stuff that they said actually being proven to be effective, but if it is effective, we say that it actually does reduce innovation. The first reason why is because there is now a chilling effect. Because if it is true that you don't want to break the mold because it might be undurable, you're far less likely to pump out new products and do lots of stuff. And that's very, very harmful, especially for the environment, because it is oftentimes maybe the subpar materials that are better for the environment that you will no longer use because there is not a tried and tested method through which that is actually sustainable or durable. So that's particularly bad. But also, at the point where there is just less creativity or less impulsivity of these corporations to do stuff, that means that you're just far less likely to have really good innovations that are super spontaneous because now there is this perception that you need to try and test everything and make perfect products to not incur these fines. That's why there's less innovation on the market overall. But secondly, if these fines do work, there is obviously just less money for facilities, less money for resources, less money to buy the best people, and less money to create the best working environments in which these people can thrive. And that means that you're just far less likely to have positive innovation that is actually very important for consumers. Note that because products depreciate over time, this means that companies probably can't ask the same amount of money that they used to for, which means that which means that at the point where they're not pumping out new products every single year and they're just not earning that much money on their pre-existing products, they just don't have any capital to innovate. Note that, and note thirdly, the importance of rapid-fire innovation and putting new products in the market all the time is innovation relies on other forms of innovation to synergize and become better overall. So if you just have long lags where no products are produced, there is way less innovation, or you just stifle that much more quickly. And that's bad because, as we've proven to you, there's a revealed preference for consumers to just buy the new phone because that's why they buy the new phone. So, lastly, very quickly on the developing world, we say this cripples manufacturing industries because even if it is true that in the Western world your repair guy is the one that is poor, that same principle is true but to vast swathes of the economy in the developing world that now just get crippled at the point where corporations can't funnel them anymore. And that means that that's far, far worse. I'm very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Speaker, know that this debate is one that happens in a world where corporations are able to do wonderful things. They can make excellent products, they can manufacture with the best goods possible, with the best materials possible, but the distinction is that planned obsolescence is a norm that means they do not choose to do that. That they make the people working in the factories, which their team wanted to defend so much, actively and deliberately produce and manufacture worse goods. You were still able to produce better goods, and you were still able to employ all those people in the factories that they wanted to talk about. The distinction here was a world in which companies actively tried to make their products worse. And that's why I think very few of the harms Aman tried to give you apply in this debate. 3 issues in the speech. Firstly, on their attempt at model bashing and whether or not this was better for consumers. Secondly, on competition and innovation. And finally, really quickly, on the environment. Let's start under this first issue about why our mechanism works, right? So they try and tell you that corporations can just shovel fines onto consumers, right? But I think the first thing to say is that you should be convinced this is empirically untrue. Clearly, fines do act as a reasonably big disincentive under the status quo, because that is the main means by which we police corporations' behavior. But mechanistically, I think at the point at which corporations do get caught up in these fines, that increases in access to information. Because people like politicians will now talk about planned obsolescence. People like journalists will report on the fact that this is something which has happened. And so generally, people now become aware that planned obsolescence is something which exists. At the point at which corporations then proceed to shovel off this fine onto the pockets of consumers, that is likely to be a horrifically unpopular policy. I think you do see significant consumer backlash. And for that reason, I think this is unlikely to occur. Fines are probably going to be a fairly reasonable form of regulation. The next thing they try to tell you then is that, well, actually, this problem doesn't exist in the status quo. Planned obsolescence is okay. And they tell you that, firstly, there existed some forms of regulation, so maybe it was going to be that bad. Note here that the pivotal framing we gave you at Claire is that this debate happens in the tech industry, which historically has been particularly difficult to regulate. Because it is an industry that is difficult to understand by the legislature, because it is an industry that can often change and is highly technical, I think given this scenario, it can often be the case that it is hard to set hard and fast lines on regulation, but insofar as you can identify planned obsolescence, or it is easy to tell when a company has actively tried to sabotage its own good by virtue of the fact that a process has been suboptimal, that was probably much better under our side. I think the final thing to say here is that Aman tells you that people have knowledge that planned obsolescence exists, and for this reason they are likely to strike back against it or not buy bad goods. But note here that the remaining of the examples Claire gave you in her speech, that planned obsolescence actually often occurs retroactively. The planned obsolescence is hidden carefully in the complicated legalese of a software update that people just download onto their phone, and all of a sudden their phone is now bricked, right? It's not something they actively and in an informed manner consented to. This was a process that was done unfairly onto these individuals. The final thing to say is that they tell you that it's okay if people keep going back to Apple for repairs because it means you keep the repairmen employed. Firstly, obviously, this is not an idea that stands in anything else, right? The harm is more important than the reparations. It's why we don't injure people so that medical workers can remain employed. But I think the second thing to say is that the harms that are incurred to the consumers are quite significant, and this does not respond to what Claire tells you, right? Claire tells you that this creates a cycle of poverty where people continually need to buy the next best product. Aman tries to glibly respond to this by telling you, well, you can just buy a cheap Motorola phone. Obviously, there are coercive pressures, which means that society tells you that you ought to have an iPhone to actively, to do things like be able to text other people in the most effective way possible, because otherwise you're constrained to SMS instead of iMessage, right? There existed lots of technological means by which these corporations maintained exclusivity. Planned obsolescence was a form of forcing you to pay these costs. It was so much worse for all the people on the ground. I think given that, you should be convinced this was significantly worse for consumers. Let's talk about what was better for competition then. Because Aman tells you that, firstly, there's a big difference in iPhones. I think this is empirically untrue. Maybe you get a bit more storage, but the average consumer probably does not notice a significant difference between 64 gigabytes and 128 gigabytes, right? Nobody actually needs that much data unless you are a professional working in specific fields, at which point you are probably just using different non-consumer instruments. Then they tell you, well, it's okay at the point at which your iPhone continues to work because, you can just keep using it or buy older products. Two responses. Firstly, obviously, this doesn't respond to what Claire tells you about retroactive forced obsolescence, where these goods can begin to break at the point at which you've owned them for a long time. I think the second thing to say is that corporations have an incentive to keep a low supply on past goods to force you to buy the latest editions so that they can earn maximum profit, right? This was very simply not an option for the vast majority of individuals. I think next they tell you that, maybe innovation is bad because you can using better materials might be worse for the environment, and it's a hard trade-off to make. I think that, no, this is unlikely to be the case. Firstly, the individuals in these tribunals are likely to be able to make that judgment. But secondly, I think that empirically, scientifically, this is untrue. Society as a whole is trending towards trying to become more and more environmentalist. I think that the best materials researched by material scientists and the ones that are going to be the best and most long-lasting are likely to be ones that adequately protect the environment and defend it. The final thing Aman tries to tell you is that, well, if these fines don't work, then people now have an incentive to just build the perfect phone so they'll never be fined. Cool, that's amazing. I think it's really good if people have an active incentive to try and develop their product to the best possible standard before release. It means that consumers get access to far better goods. It means that they last significantly longer. It means you don't have to keep replacing them. That was only a benefit. Then next they tell you that innovation relied on other forms of innovation as a saving throw. But I think this is unresponsive to what Claire tells you, which is that the innovation that occurs under the status quo is not good innovation. When your phone breaks after 2 years, you don't have an opportunity to consider whether or not you want the phone that is significantly more accessible to hearing impaired individuals, right? You need to buy a similar phone at the current price range that you are able to because you need a phone to function in modern day society. Under a world in which you have a long time span to consider what new phone you want to buy, you can look at the different attributes and see which ones are most suitable to you. And at the point that a company has created an innovation that is legitimately useful and like genuinely good for society as a whole, people are much more incentivized to buy that phone on the grounds of the innovation being much better. Under the status quo, when you are desperate at the point at which your phone is broken, companies are incentivized to default to useless innovations such as aesthetics, such as like the camera quality. That was the pivotal piece of analysis we gave you at Claire that received no response. Finally, with respect to what they wanted to say about developing world, they told you that manufacturing industries were likely to be crippled. This is obviously unresponsive to what we gave you at setup. The manufacturing industries can now just be used to produce better quality phones. This is a debate in which companies are actively choosing not to do this. At the end of the speech then, what ought you be convinced by? You ought believe that this is a policy that actively harms consumers and specifically individuals who are unlikely to be able to recurrently afford these goods. This was a policy that reduced competition, which meant that society as a whole trended to a far worse standard of living because you never got the scientific progress into the better goods. And this was a policy that meant you had to accede to the whims of China and North Korea for their lithium-ion batteries. No response from Aman, but I thought that was a really good argument from Claire. So proud to affirm. Thank you.
That's Motorola, right?
Yeah, gotcha.
Panel, the way we win this debate is simple. At the point where we prove to you that no harm accrues to consumers who engage in planned obsolescence and continue to buy their products, Side Nick Affirmative team no longer has a justification to impose an incredibly heavy fine on companies. At the point where that is true, it therefore meant all their harms on the politics or the environment was likely to be unimportant because those were more so not intrinsic harms to the consumer and whether you can punish them for lying to a consumer, but more so negative externalities as a result of maybe the production of more goods. So as a result, if I imagine prove this consumer point, we win this debate. But I also tell you the environment and politics stuff we're likely to win as well here. But let's get started. Firstly, they run a principle about, firstly on the principle. They tell us the principle just twofold. Firstly, companies should not lie. Secondly, they should follow up on their promises. The first response to this is companies cannot lie to your consumers for the reason that if you do, you're going to get hit with a massive misrepresentation lawsuit. When you get a when you have a washing machine and it says this lasts 20 years and it only lasts for 5, Australia consumer law protects you against that and tells that you can now litigate it and sue the company who are now forced to give you a new machine. So you cannot misrepresent that this phone is going to last for 10 years when it only lasts for 5 years. At the point where that is also already true, there are already existing legal mechanisms for people to remedy issues pertaining to false promises, which therefore means it is not justifiable for you to have an imposition of a fine onto the corporations. The second thing to be said here is that it probably also fail like a legal test of causation, because apparently the only reason why you buy a new phone is because it's broken down or its battery is bad. There are obviously numerous other reasons why you want to change things, right? It's not because the company lied to you. It could just because be like, there's scratches on my phone now, maybe the new phone is more aesthetic and looks better, maybe it's got a larger screen and it's better for my eyesight. There are so many consumer choices which happen when you make a decision which is outside of necessary planned obsolescence or the kind of forced the degradation of the product, such that there is actually just no harm in terms of like lying to them or if your thing just like breaks down, right? So as a result, on principle, that was there. I think the next thing they then tell you is just like, well, obviously it's really coercive because now poor people are forced to buy iPhones. This argument is silly, Jacky, because firstly, if you literally cannot buy an iPhone, you can just buy a Motorola phone like a Nokia, that is fine. The second thing to be said here is that whilst advertisements coercion thing, maybe it's sexy and cool to have it, if you literally cannot, the harm just simply does not accrue here. And because I guess this is functional for Aman, so I'm sure it's like, likely to be not a substantial harm there. So as a result, on principle, like, the case just dies already. But now onto the second question about whether this actually harms consumers. The main claim here is that it encourages anti-competitive products, that is, anti-competitive practices, which is really bad, and it gives you like two main reasons. Firstly, on manufacturers, and secondly, on aesthetic. Onto the manufacturing argument where they say, well, it's really bad because we can repair, you can only go back to Apple. That's not anti-competition, right? Because to the extent there are many alternatives if you do not like the service provided for you. You can have a Samsung phone, you can have a Nokia phone, you have a Motorola phone. Competition does exist. And at the point where Apple has failed you in not being able to provide your service, that is like totally fine, and you can seek a different producer. This is literally analogous to like going to your family doctor. There are other doctors out there if your family doctor sucks, you can go somewhere else. So as a result, it probably wasn't anti-competitive. The second thing to be said here is that they only make aesthetic changes. Note this is not actually a harm, right? Because the aesthetic changes or perceived planned obsolescence probably does actually contain actual changes. iPhone 10s and iPhone 12s don't seem very different, or at least have very similar functions, but perhaps they've got a bigger screen, perhaps they have a better camera, perhaps now you can have 5G instead of 4G on your phone, and perhaps the internal workings make it a lot more faster, maybe it can contain more RAM. I don't necessarily understand all the differences, but there are differences, and they're a valid decision for you to make, like a consumer choice, and to change things there, right? The second thing to be noted, I guess the analogy here is just that, look, it is fine for people to make decisions based on just aesthetic changes, and it is fine for corporations to appeal to them. This is the exact same thing as like a private school boy who owns teachers from ranging from light blue to dark grey. Maybe they're kind of the same, but they all still are fine, and you can legitimately make that choice there, right? So as a result, aesthetic was just not a premise for that. I guess the more important thing then is to say, well, does innovation get better under our side, or does it get better under their side? Claire's main contention here, she goes, well, innovation gets better under their side because now you focus on producing more, better quality goods, right? The first thing to establish here is that that always happens under our side as well, because the way you crack into the market is just to produce better products. To the extent that maybe Apple makes phones which break down after 2 years, if you wanted to crack into the market, maybe make a phone which breaks down in 5 years, right? And as a result, there are always competitive incentives to compete against them. The existing strategy of big tech companies to do planned obsolescence is totally fine because other people are able to adopt other strategies such as not doing planned obsolescence, and that is fine in terms of regulating the market in that sense. But the second thing here is that it obviously also helps, especially for like small businesses and startups who want to crack the market there. I guess just a piece of framing, so Jacky tries to, and I guess Dave, because he wrote the case, kind of narrow this debate down to just talking about like tech companies and saying that it is uniquely hard to regulate. The response here is that if this debate was only about tech companies, you'd likely lose all your harms pertaining to an environment already, because literally the biggest polluter here is just disposable goods and things which are already not durable. At the point where people only cycle through phones every 5 years, it probably doesn't constitute the most amount of waste which is going into the world, so you probably just like lose on the environment point there. Just say that before I forgot. But notably here, they never respond to our mechanisms as to why innovation is going to get worse. The innovation gets worse for a few reasons. The first reason is that obviously you incur like a chilling effect. When companies now need to consider the fact that, is this reaching planned obsolescence? Are we only doing aesthetic changes? Maybe it is too similar. It means they're far more less likely to invest as much into research, or at least to be more cautious in research, but you never really use it in a productive manner there. Secondly, at the point where there are lower turnovers in the amount of capital you can gain, you reduce the amount of money you can put into research, and this argument is insignificant, right? Because when you have less money, you get less innovation, and that includes your capacity to produce products which are more environmentally friendly, such as like biodegradable light bulbs. And as a result, I think on the outside of the house, even if things happen on a far more quicker rate, one of the premises of innovation is just that you do so much shit and you put so much into it and you make a bunch of mistakes, but maybe the mistake is going to be like God's will here and it's going to create like an ultimate light bulb. At the point you remove all of that, it is very unlikely you're going to actually get anything which is like particularly, you like to get far less goods and you like to get things which aren't that great at the end of that. So under this issue then, what we do with it, innovation was important and we can get far more. They just stagger over a long time, and maybe it's like maybe you get more consumer choice now because you can choose between different things. That is fine. Under the status quo, you can still choose between different things, so it's unclear why that is a harm. So as a result, they probably lose there. Dealing with the last two issues in this debate about everything else, right? Let's deal with the political harm David comes up with, which says the depletion of rare earth minerals means that you're now dependent on countries like China and Russia. This argument is silly for a few reasons, because firstly, you do not stop the production of phones which require the same rare earth minerals. The things which make the relationship particularly particularly bad isn't the quantity of product, it is the dependency and need that you have to have these products. So if you continue to produce these phones, it therefore means your relationship with China and Russia are still going to be like that and can still weaponize it in a trade war. Maybe you need less, but you still do need it. That is always going to be a coercive power which makes politics worse, which therefore means this harm likely falls out of debate. The second thing I'm going to tell you here is the harm about the environment. Don't you think the mechanism here is just kind of like consumerism? The first thing I already respond to here, which is just to say, if this is about tech companies, then likely the impact of the same is substantially low. But secondly, at the point where
provide and create products which are going to be better, which are more biodegradable, and things which are likely to be more helpful in that fashion, right? And I think the third thing to establish here is that I think it's not really obsolescence which contributes the most pollution. It is just things that are in fast fashion. It is things which aren't necessarily related to technology or the light bulbs you use, and all of that stuff is going to continue to exist. So the inability to scale the harm means we probably can't claim a substantial impact there. No, you want to weigh this impact against the impact we tell you about the impact on the developing world and manufacturing companies. Jacky's kind of good response just to say, well, now you still produce stuff, you just produce better quality stuff, but that's unimpactful because obviously if it's better quality and you can use something for longer, it means you need less workers or you need less people to do so because there is less of a demand to constantly produce as much products, which therefore means the impact of that is people get laid off, people are now going to be unemployed, and that was why the impact was still going to occur. Even if you produce better quality stuff, you still need a higher turnover rate for things to be effective. So at the end of this speech, while apology is a principle does not exist, but consumers are not harmed, and everything else which David said and tried to package in the speech was just quite silly.
More than a decade ago, the iPhone 4 was released, and that was a game changer. What they managed to do was they managed to weaponize the outside rim of the case to simultaneously serve as a case, but also as an antenna, so that that phone could connect to the internet while also being really small. They changed the way that that battery worked so that it could actually last a whole day. And they changed all the functions so that people could use that phone functionally as a computer and make the economy and their lives far, far more efficient. Now, more than a decade down the track and 10 iPhones later, it's like basically the same, right? The iPhone 12, the iPhone 13, I will literally gamble that the iPhone 25 will be similar to that iPhone 4. And the reason for that is because of planned obsolescence. Because of the way that companies have upped the replacement rate of phones and have relieved the pressure on them to make actual innovation that makes people's lives better. And that is something that we oppose in this debate. The first issue in this speech will be about competition and innovation, the second about coercion, and thirdly on resource use. Firstly, on competition and innovation. Kat tells us that essentially they get more competition because when phones break down, you have an opportunity to seek a competitor. This logic is flawed for the reason that even though they get a faster replacement rate, that replacement rate and that competition is not meaningful. And the reason for this is simple. Firstly, it is because when phones break down faster and consumers need to find phones quicker, companies have less time to have that innovation. The second reason, and this analysis Claire gives to no response, is the idea that the prompt for someone to get a new phone on their side is when your phone breaks down suddenly and you suddenly need a new phone, which means A, you don't have the critical capacity to actually know what you want and you're just trying to find something as similar as possible to replace that, and B, you literally just have no time and need to find it in a short amount of time, right? Which means that on their side, when a phone breaks out and people are prompted to buy a new product, their prompt is to find something that is relatively similar to their current phone. On our side, when phones are still lasting, when there's no need to replace your phone because your phone can still call and the battery is fine, the only prompt for you to actually change your phone is if a competitor came that gave you vastly more beneficial function and innovation in that phone, where you felt like your phone was so old and shitty that you actually had to turn to that competitor. Which means on a mechanistic sense, yes, they have a faster replacement rate, yes, they have more frequent windows of competition, but that is hollow and empty because people just find new phones with aesthetic differences, while on our side, people actually have functional differences that change their quality of life. Kat tries to weasel her way out of this when she says, well, there's no harm to just people wanting aesthetic things because that is their choice. Firstly, we tell you that choice is corrupted anyway and is not legitimate because people are coerced into buying these products, but also people are coerced by the planned obsolescence that they don't know about and that is misleading. But secondly, it comes at the opportunity cost of more functional change, which actually changes people's quality of life. Yes, maybe rich white people only care about having a prettier phone and that makes their quality of life marginally better. But obviously the change we cared about was things like the fact that internet speed in developing countries through phones upgrading to 3G to 5G could get so much faster and people could actually work a lot more and get a lot more wages through that, right? Those functional changes were the things that made huge upheavals in people's quality of lives, especially in the poorest countries. Then they tell you, well, there's no real problem, so the government shouldn't intervene. And the fundamental misunderstanding here is like, often in debates, one side's like the government should and should not intervene. The test for when a government should intervene is that on default, governments should not intervene because they want to keep the market free. But governments intervene to free up the market when that market organically is not free by itself. We tell you that the way that our case works is that planned obsolescence makes the market less competitive because of the stuff I told you about how they get less meaningful change, and because of the fact that to get repairs you have to go to the same kind of Apple whatever company, right? Which means that it is legitimate for the government to intervene because their intervention makes the market far, far freer. Then they tell you, well, there's a chilling effect on innovation. And because companies have to double check themselves every time they make something, this makes their job a lot harder and this makes the economy a lot less efficient and kills innovation. Firstly, this topic is about planned obsolescence. Plan implies things are intentional. This is not a company accidentally did something wrong and they're thinking, oh, am I towing the line or something? Tech companies are very smart and they know when they're fucking over and screwing over products intentionally. But secondly, Jacky gives you analysis about how planned obsolescence in the majority of cases is retroactive, right? It means after you have created the product, you are now taking away a function or impairing or tampering a function. And what that means is that companies don't actually have to do anything to follow the regulation on our side. Rather, they should do nothing to follow the regulation on their side. On their side is when companies are actively tampering with the products. So it's actually cheaper and easier to follow the regulation on our side anyway. Let's move on to the second issue of coercion. We tell you that this model is, economically exploitative. They say, if you can't buy the phone because it's too expensive, there's no harm because you don't buy it. Obviously, there's a harm in marginal increases in expense, and that causes marginal decreases in your life. But then they tell you, companies can't lie to consumers, obviously, right? Yes, the ACCC exists, but the thing we tell you is that the way planned obsolescence works is quite complex and quite misleading, and that's the way companies do it, right? The way that companies will make an iPhone is they'll make the iPhone last, say, for 4 years, but then they'll stop the software updates to the iPhone after 2 years. You can't sue them for the guarantees, because physically, that iPhone has lasted for 4 years, but functionally, you can't keep up with your friends because that software update has expired after 2 years. That's the way companies keep getting away with it. It's not as black and white as the other team thinks. And then they lastly tell you here that this is unjust because the fine is passed on to consumers. Firstly, this is very unintuitive. If this fine was so heavy and such a severe penalties, companies just would not do planned obsolescence so as to not incur that cost and pass it on to consumers. Secondly, companies do not have an incentive to pass on that fine because it would be a huge scandal. Because in their world, people now know A, that companies have tampered with my iPhone, B, that they're getting fined for it, and C, they're trying to make me pay more for that iPhone. Of course that incentive is not to do that. That'll be the hugest backlash on their side. Thirdly, you need a sufficiently inelastic consumer base to actually have that cost be passed on. That's why smoking tax is passed on, because those people are super addictive. While we tell you that obviously there is a degree of coercion for these people, it's not so great to the degree that if iPhone selling costed $2,000 rather than $1,000, people wouldn't ask questions about it and go to competitors. And lastly, to the degree at which this marginal tax is passed on, it's a relatively marginal harm because the degree to which companies can absorb large taxes means that the degree to which they pass on costs is $1,000 to say GST, $1,100. Compare this to the fact that we tell you people have to pay, say, for twice as many iPhones because those phones keep replacing. That cost adds up far, far more in the long term. Last issue in terms of resource use. The big point we tell you is that this is politically devastating because you are now reliant on politically perverse actors for these materials. What Kat tells you is, well, we don't stop production on iPhones on our side. We still have to rely on those phones. The thing is, the rate at which you deplete that rare earth material correlatively increases the leverage they have over you. Because in the future, there is a possibility to find those alternatives. There is a possibility to use hydrogen fuel cells rather than rare earth minerals, and this is something a science degree student told me. And secondly, there are alternative places you can find those rare earth minerals like Greenland that have yet to be harvested. The difference is they reduce the time window to find those alternatives, so during that interim period, China has a greater control on you, and that is net deadweight loss for everyone in society. And lastly, in terms of environment, we tell you that even though, yes, this may not be the biggest polluter, the fact that these are chemically bonded products or cheap plastics are happening at a faster replacement rate is the thing that destroys the environment because so much waste is happening. Every step we can do along the way to stop that harm is a good thing. For these reasons, we are very proud to be friends.
three questions in this debate. Firstly, how bad was the issue, and did that warrant government intervention and therefore principally justify their protection of consumers? This is an important issue because they stake the majority of their harms here. It's 7 minutes of David's speech. First, they have to prove principal coercion, and second, they say that you have a practical harm of needlessly spending your money. But if we prove it isn't too bad, and our line throughout the entire case is that the comparative is still spending money on a bunch of useless things, then we win the debate very easily because their benefit is so marginal and small. Let's talk first about the principle. They say consent doesn't exist, and therefore, like, you consent to this product existing for 5 years and not 2 years. That's an enormous mischaracterization because first, we've provided the response that people do actually know planned obsolescence has happened. It's like come out in the news quite recently. It's actually like a well-known issue. They give no response to that. But second, after your first 2 years of buying a phone, you realise the battery dies very quickly. For the next 30 phones you buy over the course of your lifetime, you understand that planned obsolescence is a thing. It's just that first purchase. That's like a tiny principal harm. But third, we also say that there's recourse through warranties. And to the extent they want to say you can't go back and, for example, like you won't be able to deal with this corporation and get the warranty. That warranty is for the first 2 years on most like Apple products, for example. That's a reasonable period to be able to say, my battery percentage has dropped by 30% during that time because, as they say, the planned obsolescence is that severe. The next thing they do then is analogize this principal harm to government regulation and therefore fraud. But this was obviously meaningful, and they give no example of like fraud, for example, but this is meaningfully different because first, you are aware of the risks, that's what I've just demonstrated, but second, you're getting a return for your money. Fraud is where you put your money into something and it's taken, it's stolen, you get nothing back from it. If we can prove you get utility from that phone, which we obviously can, then there's no real principal harm. Then let's talk about the practical of them, people needlessly losing money. The premise that they run with and never actually develop into a sophisticated argument is just you're spending money and you don't have it elsewhere. First, totally uncomparative. You're going to spend it anyway, and we provide the analysis that there is a culture of consumerism. That is firstly through advertising, which exists under either side, but secondly, that advertising is most potent when you're advertising for luxury goods, for example, clothing, which means conspicuous consumption is like if you buy something, you will feel good about it. That's obviously not even what phones do. So, like under that analysis themselves, that means they're spending money on places which I would also note are most likely to be in the nation themselves, in developed nations, not developing nations. That'll be important. But they're spending all their money on things, they're just saving money which they would spend elsewhere. But the second reason is there's no reason to believe that you wouldn't replace this phone anyway after like 3 years just because it's not new, right? So if people are like, if this consumerism exists, then if it has a couple scratches on it, or like it's just not working as well, there's no reason to believe that people wouldn't go back and just buy a new phone anyway. They provide no reason. Second, Affirmative strangely impacts this by saying this creates a cycle of poverty. First, most people in poverty are able to make a trade-off between a large lump sum purchase, which you have to spend on a technologically complex good. They will not do it. Second of all, say it's $1,000 every 3 years in their best case. Even people who live in poverty make about 50 grand every 3 years. There is no reason to believe that 1 grand isn't a good purchase for them because they never prove that the utility doesn't exist. The question then is about, is there actual utility in buying this technological product? Because even if there is a principal harm of coercion, if you still get value from it, then we should still value the fact that you're getting value from something you would appreciate. And they never show that because new technology is just awesome. You know what I mean? Like either you're a worker, you're a student, you're a child. It's great. It's very great for you. And obviously, like you're still going to enjoy it over those 3 years. It's just you lose out on 2 years of having it. But we also tell you buy things which are more superficial instead. That's the conspicuous consumption analysis, and that worsens your self-image, for example. That's also coercive. They push people more towards that. You know what? It's a principal harm on their side. Second issue is about harms to innovation and developing nations. And this ought to be weighed much higher than their claims. Just because they don't spend time in the debate rebutting it does not mean they get away with saying this is not the most important issue, because they provide literally no benefit to this stakeholder. For every dollar they say people in developed nations don't spend, they provide the own analysis why we get that dollar to a person in a developed nation who is now paid more for actually producing this. Second Affirmative just says in their introduction, we will still pay them the same amount of money. You do not have as much revenue. That is the point of your case. You do not produce as many goods. People are not spending as much money. That means we can get that money to, for example, improve the conditions in that place or pay these people more regularly because they literally work more hours because they're producing more goods. And that is a stable job for those people, and that also improves the infrastructure of that area so they're less like at risk of, for example, things collapsing and killing them. They then say, well, you're producing a better quality good, which means it takes longer time to do that. But again, their point there is that if you're producing a better quality good, it's better quality because it lasts longer. You have to produce less of them because less people are buying them. That is the extent of their rebuttal to this enormous harm we bring you. They've impacted themselves. Every dollar someone saves in that country, they lose in another country. And we obviously ought value the people in the developing nation more, because first, they're poorer and they're much more vulnerable. And secondly, as I mentioned, there is a realistic risk of them dying from the conditions which exist in those sweatshops. Secondly, let's talk about innovation. The benefits of this were massive, but let's first ask whether they do enough to rebut our actual proof of it. As Kat notes, they don't actually respond to our mechanisms here, which was your counteract depreciation, because you can justify the sale of more products only by saying it's more technologically developed. Then they and also like have competitive incentives to mitigate the harms, etc. They don't respond. Instead, they just say innovations are useless under our side because there's no reason to actually do them well because people aren't making a meaningful choice in terms of what they buy. The first response is that, well, I think to some extent it's just an intellectual curiosity from scientists who have spent their entire time like working on how to better technologically develop things. It's likely they're not going to research something which is totally useless. But secondly, that's enormously ahistoric because David's intro, for example, is how things have developed like with the iPhone 4. But like, as we told you from first, innovation happens when you get more of it, and it happens very quickly, and that means you have to keep pushing and you have to keep finding a barrier. But also, 10 years ago was when planned obsolescence was worse. It was literally worse and no one knew about it. We got an innovation during that time. But the third thing is, they provide no reason why innovations, which are the most useful, are excluded by planned obsolescence. So for example, the processing power of an Apple phone or computer is probably the most useful thing because it means you get it's like how digital computers work. You can adapt that benefit to all other things. It's like you can say that a battery won't last as long, but like Apple has made it smaller, which allows for more complex computing technology, right? Those were all the benefits of innovation, which weren't cancelled out just because planned obsolescence existed. They provided no reason why those things were mutually exclusive. Okay. Given we've proven innovation, let's look at the third and final issue here, because we're ahead on the fact that we get benefits to developing nations. But I also think the issue with their case is just that for both political and environmental outcomes, they're hugely uncomparative. On the environment, we push this as a harm to their side, because first, if money is spent elsewhere, as we proved through consumerism, it's like 10 litres of water to produce like a sweater. That's an enormous environmental harm. But secondly, they rely on the premises that disposing of waste in an environmental way is worse than having a larger digital footprint. What we'll tell you is things are now more efficient to charge, and for example, electricity is a more important issue in this debate because that's what literally fuels climate change, right? Whereas, obviously, when you're disposing of products which are just like made up of unenvironmentally friendly waste, you can just put that in a hole. You know what I mean? That is not going to cause the climate to rise to such a high extent that like sea levels rise and it's an existential threat to humanity. We provide reasons why, obviously, based on our premise of innovation, you will be less likely to get climate catastrophe. On politics, firstly, it goes both ways. So now the US gets all the best scientists from China, which means they can exert political pressure. But also, China was literally benefited from manufacturing. That's how they developed their economy. There is no reason to believe that they would now be friendly to the United States when they're having less manufacturing in that nation. That was a premise we proved. And also, I just don't believe North Korea holds all the precious metals in the world. That doesn't make any sense to me. For that reason,